This is the reality show on Calabash TV.
We want to welcome to our studios here at Calabash TV, Dr. Marcus Day, who's the Director of Caribbean Drug and Alcohol Research Institute. And we want to speak with you, Dr. Day. First of all, welcome to Calabash TV.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to speak with you about the cannabis movement, about efforts here in St. Lucia to discuss the issue as an industry. Now, I saw recently, I think, a statement that you put out, and we know that Cabinet met recently on this issue. Could you bring us up to date on what exactly is the very latest in relation to this?
Okay, so the government has been very active in promoting the change in the cannabis law. We're not really quite sure where we're going in terms of deregulation, regulation, what have you, but the Prime Minister has been pushing this as a campaign promise from 2016, and in the process of doing that, they recruited this Malaysian consulting firm, Penmandu, and added cannabis as one of the agricultural products for agricultural diversification into that exercise. From that report, there was a timeline, and government is actually within the timeline. August was a point where the next stage would happen, and at that point, through two cabinet meetings, one when the Prime Minister was out, and then followed by the one on Monday, there was discussion of forming a cannabis commission for St. Lucia, reforming it. We had one previously that was didn't perform, was underfunded. So we're putting in place a new cannabis commission to not really investigate whether we should do this or not, but to create a public awareness campaign for the general public to inform them of the latest developments in the science around cannabis and why we are moving forward in that direction, so that people understand. 40 years of anti-drug messaging has been so effective that people need to be informed of what's actually current in the science.
So is the focus still on reform of the law, or are we still talking about it as an industry?
No, it's government is pursuing it as an agricultural diversification product, which would be basically industrial and the offshoots from that. So the best agriculture is one where you produce an agricultural product and also process it rather than send it off as a raw material. So we're looking at those avenues. We're talking Invest St. Lucia. Mr. Pinkley Francis has met with a number of investors from Canada, the Cannabis Movement. Pancho de Carias has met with people, different people, same people, bringing people together because we're all working on the same platform, basically. Investors who want to process cannabis oil here and export the oil rather than exporting the raw product. So I think that as a industry, as an income for our farmers, I mean, the whole Penmandu process was all about how many farmers would be employed, how much money per acreage would be generated, how would we rotate crops from traditional food crops that are priority crops into cannabis so that we can rest the soil. So there was a number of areas outside of the usual personal use of cannabis and sacramental use of cannabis and medicinal use, actually, because we're really talking about industrial and agricultural products.
Just to get it clear, so who involved is the commission in that aspect of it?
Okay, so the commission has not been officially formed yet. I believe that, so I believe that Cabinet, in their meeting on Monday, though I don't have the details, finalized the membership and the chairmanship, and then they'll publish that in due course, and then that commission, which would be made up of mostly people in the government and two representatives of civil society, the Rastafarian movement and the Cannabis Movement, and they will put together that educational campaign. It's proposed to have 36 individual meetings around the island. We figured that 17, one in each constituency, wasn't enough because such constituencies are so widespread and diverse that some places would need 2, maybe 3. So we came up with a number 36, and that's going to happen hopefully within the next 6 months or so. That we'll travel to community, meet with people, talk to them about what the science is, listen to their concerns, because a lot of people have had experience with people on cannabis that had mental illnesses, and so they have some very negative views of how cannabis is. So we need to waylay those fears that they might have and talk about the benefits of it.
I don't know if you have full details on it, but in terms of the composition of the commission, is the private sector going to be involved in it? Because you mentioned the Rastafarians and the movement itself, the cannabis movement.
Interesting. I don't know. From what I heard, it was the Ministry of Education, Health, Invest St. Lucia, Commerce, Trade, Commerce and Trade, I believe are the same. I don't know, but it's interesting because it should be. The Hotel and Tourism Association, I believe actually I may have heard them mention the Chamber. I mean, these are organizations that are very strong in St. Lucia and should be involved in this process.
And there was any commitment, again, still early because we haven't seen the official documents, any commitments to providing funding, because the last time it was underfunded?
From what I heard from through the grapevine, there was $100,000 budgeted. So about $2,500 per meeting. And of course, many of the things that we'll probably use will be borrowed from government itself, the locations, the PA system, those kind of things. So hopefully, we'll have some nice handouts, some PowerPoints, some talk, some refreshments, let people be at ease, and they can discuss what's important to them.
And is it safe to say that these discussions can start this year or sometime next year?
I believe that they really want to get going as quickly as possible, because I think part of the process, part of the concern is backlash, political backlash, right, within communities. The cannabis movement is very adamant that this is not a political issue. And we do not want to hear the opposition saying no just because government says yes. This is a national issue that concerns everybody. It's a medicinal issue. It's a personal rights, human rights issue. It's a sacramental issue. And so we're hoping that the politics of it will be out of it, and we can just talk about the science, we can talk about community, and we can help people move forward.
Any discussions so far with, even in the previous iteration of the commission, with the opposition as well, and other political parties? Well,
the cannabis movement met with the opposition last year sometime. I attended that meeting. It was chaired by Mr. Pierre. It was a very good meeting. It was very positive. So I think that hopefully they will hold to that, and that we will see this issue not as a political one. You talk to Mr. Decarius, and he tells you that they've been fighting for this since 1997, so there's been a number of governments come and go. So, and everybody in opposition is in favor, and everybody in government has reasons why not to. So, I applaud the government of the day because they're literally moving forward, maybe not as quickly as a pace as we would like it, but nonetheless, the wheels of government crank slow,
Are we, because St. Vincent, the Medicinal Cannabis Authority in St. Vincent, put out a statement recently, and I'm sure you saw that statement. Did it concern you that, we're way behind on this?
We have some real concerns about how this is going to roll out in St. Lucia. And from the cannabis movement's perspective, my personal feelings is that we cannot disenfranchise neither the growers who have been growing for years and the people who have been selling it, the vendors and brokers of cannabis. And so we need the amount of money that's generated through the cannabis industry currently as an illegal activity is, I estimate, to be around $150,000 a day in money changing hands, right? Through data that's produced from our school surveys and our number of people who are using cannabis. Such a huge industry, and a number of people are surviving on that money. Farmers are surviving on that money. We have to ensure that these people are not disenfranchised. We see this all over the world. Literally, white suits are taken over, and black people who have been criminalized forever around cannabis are being marginalized in the industry. So we are adamant that this has to take place in a way that does not disenfranchise these people. St. Vincent, I believe, has not done that, and there's a disenfranchisement of the farmers. I think Antigua is going to have the same issue. Antigua licenses are $100,000 or something like that. They gave one license to the Rastas that they can use to broker to borrow against. I don't feel that that's enough. You know, we talk about reparations often. There's reparations in the war on drugs. There are a number of people who have suffered because of their use of cannabis, and they have to be made whole in this whole argument. So I think that that's one of the areas that maybe we're going a little slow because we have more stringent requirements that we see, at least as the cannabis movement, in terms of making sure that people benefit from a new regulated industry.
St. Vincent, because you mentioned some farmers are being disenfranchised and so on, but let me just read to, because I just put out a statement that they issued concerning who they give approved licenses. There are 8 local farmers producers cooperatives with an aggregated membership of over 100 traditional cultivators, 13 traditional cultivators of cannabis who applied individually, non-traditional farmers 3, consisting of Class A and Class B, and also 10 companies with directors from nationals of OECS, CARIFORUM, North America, Europe, and Africa. Now you mentioned that Invest Lucia has been involved in it, and I just want to develop on the point that you made. When we talk about investing in St. Lucia, normally it's, and that's the current political discussion in terms of who benefits the most. How much of, and I think that's the point you're making in terms of the concern that local farmers are not the ones who end up having a relationship similar to what we had with bananas, where we were not much of the marketing, so farmers basically got the rest of after you took off all the expenses and so on. What is being done, and or is the St. Vincent model not the best in terms of our approach to this?
I think thank you for reminding me about that, because one of the things that I liked about that was the very concessionary fees given to the local farmers as opposed to the foreign farmers, and I think that was a good thing. The cannabis movement would prefer not to see foreigners owning land and hiring people to work in the fields, chop, chop, chop. No, we want to see our foreign investors come in and buy products, give technical assistance to our farmers, bring seeds that they want, the certain strains that they want to be produced, and work with our farmers to provide the product that they want for export. And then we have great expertise in the country in growing cannabis for personal consumption, and so I don't think that in that area there's even an issue. I think that we have to be aware that even in St. Vincent they did not deregulate, decriminalize at all. So there's still no personal use legal in St. Vincent, and the only thing that I can think about is we're struggling now to ensure that what we in the past called drug dealers, which were cannabis, small-scale cannabis brokers, and cannabis farmers are not disenfranchised. I think in a way St. Vincent came up with a very brilliant solution, which is don't legalize it, and therefore everybody who's doing what they're doing now can continue to do what they do, and we just won't enforce the law, basically. And I think that that's what they're doing over there. I don't agree with that method. I think that we need to bring people into legitimacy. We need to get people paying taxes, right? We need to get people making sure that they don't use Gramazone on their crops or 7 powder to chase away the bugs and stuff like that, and then you're inhaling that when you smoke it. So I think that there's some issues that we would prefer to see a regulated environment where we can work with farmers to ensure that the standards are in place. And in fact, that's a good segue to the fact that the Standards Bureau here has formed a standards committee for cannabis to participate in the ASTM International Committee on Cannabis, D37. I actually am the chairman of that standards committee here in St. Lucia. And that's very exciting. That's another example of how we're moving forward, how government is supporting this move, even though it's very quiet and very on the side. The cannabis movement is in the process of forming a cannabis farmers cooperative with the help and cooperation of the Cooperatives Department and the Ministry of Sustainable Development. So you have a number of different ministries moving this process forward in a way that I think is very thoughtful rather than just tumbling into it.
I shouldn't say this, that the demise of the banana industry was kind of helpful to the environment, but with people going to the forest and cutting less for bananas, there was a little bit of rejuvenation going on. If we're going to go into this full scale, how will and you mentioned sustainable development, how will the environmental issues be addressed?
I think right now what we have is a huge environmental nightmare. We have people going into the forest, we have people cutting down trees, we have people carrying water in plastic jugs that are oil jugs, and they rot away in the sun in 3 weeks, and then they just leave that behind. They're carrying tires into the forest to plant their weed in tires. And they leave in the refuge behind, and it's terrible, actually. So what we think, in a regulated environment where people don't have to hide, and where we can look at providing land for them within the agricultural estates that we already have down in the South, in Union, in these places, other lands government lands that we have, right? And I think, and work with the farmers to do it in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't use chemicals, doesn't use pesticides, composting, soils. I mean, we want to see good agricultural practices across the board. I mean, I'm adamant in the banning of gramazone and Roundup. I mean, our prostate cancer in St. Lucia is the highest cancer of any cancer, and it only affects half the population, and it's because of these chemicals. And government is reticent about universal health care because of the costs associated with cancer in particular, and yet we have these same chemicals coming into the country that are feeding our cancer. So I think there needs to be a number of areas that need to be dealt with, and we're hoping that we can wrap this all up in this cannabis movement so that we are more sustainable and less with chemicals and pesticides in our soil across the board, whether it's our food products, our cannabis products, what have you.
So I guess you'll have a healthy discussion with the pesticides board and so on in this.
My post yesterday on Facebook was, who actually is on this pesticide control board and what do they do? I have a little piece of land up in Mossy, and I in the house that I had on the property where people lived over the years, I found a half a bottle of gramazone. It was, I guess, a 4-liter bottle, right? And it was like, and we all looked at it like, what are we going to do with this thing, right? So we actually put it into another bucket with a sealed lid, and I brought it to the Ministry of Agriculture at Union, and I said, here, I don't want this. And they were like, we don't want it. And I'm like, but if I take this away, what am I going to do with it? Where am I going to throw it? I can't even dig a hole and bury it because it's such a horrible poison, right? And it made me realize that we don't even have in place, when we make that transition to a more organic farming situation, the actual exercise of getting rid of all these chemicals is going to be a major task. And I hope that our government and pesticide control board are up to the task of ridding our environment of these poisons.
How much thought has been given, if we're thinking of this as an industry? I know we talk about farmers, and there are two issues there. One, when you speak with a lot of farms, they're saying, well, it's hard for us to get workers, and nobody wants to do the farm. When you speak to a lot of young people, nobody's thinking of farming. Do you think that we might see a change in terms of mindset when it comes to, or do we have to figure out something else in terms of getting laborers, farmers to work the land?
I think there's thousands of people growing cannabis right now, and I think that finding people to help grow cannabis won't be too much of an issue. And I think that, and in fact, the cannabis movement in our discussions are hoping that the legalization of cannabis and growing cannabis will promote a revitalization of agriculture in general, backyard gardens. We would be encouraging people to not just grow cannabis, but to grow vegetables also. And we know that a lot of people who do grow cannabis now actually have vegetable patches also. So it's not just a sole track. And I think, the other thing that we want is we want to make sure that there's a very vibrant cooperative that exists that can represent the farmers to the outside purchasers, that we can ensure that the majority of the money goes to the farmer in a cooperative basis rather than a private enterprise basis. We're hoping that government will actually do a PPP with the cooperative where we will manage the industry. We actually are looking at the Banana Growers Association as a model, when the SLBGA was strong, bananas were doing well. It's when it started to break apart that, and then some politics got into it and some other that we had a problem. But we would like to see a centralized point of purchase and contact for outsiders who are coming in to purchase or be in part invest in our cannabis industry, and to ensure that our farmers in particular are not disenfranchised.
You mentioned the Banana Association and the model. One of the challenges that the banana had was competition from overseas, and if it becomes globally an industry and accepted globally, that we will face competition probably from the same Latin Americans and other countries that can do it a lot cheaper and probably at vast amounts and so on. Is that something that's being considered in terms, because I know Jamaica and St. Vincent probably have a foothold so far, but how difficult will it be for us to have that foothold in there?
I think there's a number of discussions around this. My personal views is that we are a small island developing state, and it's kind of silly for us to pursue anything that comes on to that requires a massive scale, because that's not what we're about. So, you know, and this goes across the board. When we go for tourism, I don't believe that we should be in mass tourism. I think we should be in niche tourism that attracts people of a certain niche, and they pay some money, and we keep our country in an environmentally pristine state. We have to build a product that people want. I think, for me, I want to see medical cannabis in the country and available to people who have various non-communicable diseases and issues. I want to see people who smoke cannabis as a sacramental right, to have that privilege without being harassed by government. And I want to see people who just want to use cannabis for their own personal use, of which much I characterize as medicinal cannabis use on a personal level, basically. But I want to see them have that privilege. And I think that the market, as I said, there's $150,000 changing hands on a daily basis for cannabis now in St. Lucia, and that doesn't include the tourism industry. How many hotels, if we legalize cannabis, how many hotels will have a bud meister working on staff, right? Like their wine guy, and they'll have a little place there, and it'll be different, and it'll be local products. We're not going to import cannabis from overseas, so you'll have different varieties that people are growing now or will grow for that market. So I think that, to me, I mean, Jamaica is capitalizing on the fact that cannabis, well, forever has always been available in Jamaica to the tourist industry, right? And now it's even less of a problem, right? If we can move towards a truly regulated industry where we can have these products available for our tourists. You know, a tourist gets off the boat in Point Seraphin and is asked where they can buy some weed, and gets directed over into the market area, and then gets mugged, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, one of the ideas that I have that I'd like to see implemented is that we have a training program for cannabis vendors in the city, a medallion program. They get a medallion, they have a place, they vend, they pay their daily fee just like any other vendor, and we teach them not only about the cannabis, but we teach them about tourism so that they can talk to the tourists who come to them. And the tourist says, okay, I want to buy a joint. Where can I go and do this? Well, there's a designated smoking place over there. You can go there. Nobody will bother you. You know, you can, and these kind of things to make the experience for our guests more pleasurable when it comes to just more pleasurable. I mean, what do we sell? We sell pleasure, basically. That's our product. And cannabis would enhance that product, I believe. So I'm not so worried about the international trade. Like you say, there's some big players out there. Uganda's putting in 1 million acres of cannabis or something like that. I mean, it's just incredible, right? Canada's doing hemp, but I think that we will have a place in the industry, and I think being in the Caribbean and that whole mystique around the Caribbean will add some benefit to our product placement, and people will seek it out. And of course, if you have 1 million tourists a year, and they come here and they enjoy our cannabis, and they go home and they see that there's cannabis for sale from St. Lucia, that also adds to it. Or cannabis-infused chocolates.
Endless possibilities.
Exactly.
Health. When you face the road, it's obviously an issue that will come up in terms of, especially we've had this situation of COPD and so on. Quite a lot of young men are succumbing to that. How do you plan to respond to that concern, that if it's legalized or if it's available more freely, that we'll have a serious health issue to deal with?
Well, I think so. To address the COPD thing, and I think this is really important. I think anybody who's watching, I think it's critical. If you mix tobacco and cannabis together and smoke it, right now, as you watch this, I want you to take a deep breath. And if you start coughing, then you're on the verge of having COPD, right? And this is a serious problem. And I think it relates to how each product is used. When somebody pulls on a cannabis cigarette, they pull a deep draw, and they hold it and then they exhale. When you puff a cigarette, the word puff, you don't really pull it in, you don't hold it. Yet when people mix cannabis with tobacco, especially cigarette tobacco, which is not just tobacco, but a number of additives and poisons in it, they pull it deep and they hold it in. And we're seeing now the onset of COPD at 30, 35, whereas normally in a cigarette smoker, a tobacco smoker, you might see people presenting at 60, 65, men primarily. But and so that's a problem, and that's an educational problem, and it's a problem with the availability of a product to carry the cannabis. People nowadays are breeding cannabis that's really dense and really tight, and it doesn't really burn well in a pipe or a cigarette. And they put tobacco to make it burn. It's a carrier, right? If we get to a point where cannabis is legal, we can use fat leaf. We can use the other leaf of the cannabis as the same product, and they can mix it with that, so you don't have that tobacco. We want to see the tobacco regulations that WHO are promoting to be put in place. We want to see tobacco smoking as regulated as cannabis smoking. We want to see only designated places, no public smoking. We want to see no public smoking in general, whether it's cannabis or tobacco. So I think that these are some of the areas that we can pursue in a regulated environment. With medicinal cannabis, we have a real issue with our physicians are not educated in the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is literally only about 30 years old in our discovery of it. Medicinal cannabis has only been around since 1998 in California and British Columbia. And so we've only had 20 years to investigate legal smoking, patients rather than criminals. And the National Institute of Drug Abuse in America, which funds 85% of the world's drug research, has not been particularly favorable in promoting research that is favorable to cannabis. So most of the research that's been produced up until this day has been devised to show the most negative effects. And interestingly enough, many of these research products actually show good things. So you devise a product, a research project to show negative effects, and then you come up with good stuff at the end, means that it must really be good. So I think that from that point of view, we need to have more continuing medical education for our physicians on cannabis and cannabinoid medicines, for our pharmacists also, because they'll be responsible for dispensing medicinal cannabis. I am somebody who believes that cannabis use is medicinal in general. It actually promotes, it actually inhibits viral uptake. Think about the number of real RASs you see in casualty, unless it's an accident, right? See how many do you see in the cancer wards? You know, and then if you investigate, you'll see it's either tobacco and cannabis together, or they drink rum. But people who are basically sticking to a lifestyle where it's cannabis and natural foods, you're not going to see them presenting for the kind of NCDs that we're seeing nowadays for people who are eating white rice, white macaroni, and white sugar, basically.
You mentioned medical research and so on. What is the possibility, and is the Commission going to be looking at that as well, in terms of St. Lucians getting opportunities, scholarships, government making scholarships available? Because if there's going to be an industry in the future, how are we preparing, and how should we be preparing to get our students to start thinking about labs and becoming researchers? I know we have, you mentioned pharmacists and so on, but there are other scope of employment in other areas.
Well, I mean, in the medical schools nowadays, there is becoming more and more focus on the endocannabinoid system. As we discover more, it's being presented. I remember when my daughter was in medical school in Cuba, maybe 4 years ago, she actually sent me a message saying, hey, they talked about it for a half hour today. And I was like, yeah, that's great, you know, because there was a study that was done a couple of years before that a researcher went to every medical school around and said, you know, are you doing this? And nobody was even covering it in their curriculum. I think that the opportunities, I mean, a prominent attorney here in St. Lucia, his daughter is actually in America studying cannabis in general, cannabis cultivation and just the various chains. I think she's in somewhere up in Northern America, Minnesota, Wisconsin, someplace like that. So, you know, people are taking advantage of it. People see that there's a trajectory towards a legality that will open up new educational opportunities and new business opportunities. And you know, again, our concern is that we seize on as many of these business and educational opportunities for St. Lucians as we can and have them benefit in the industry.
So for the moment, we have to wait for a cabinet conclusion. We have to wait for that commission, the new commission, to be formed and so on, and to be announced before we can move ahead.
I think the Penmandu exercise had a timeline that actually looked at 2021 as a regulated environment. Hopefully we can move there quicker, or at least move there incrementally. I'd like to see an official decriminalization, at least to start. We need, at this point, it seems disingenuous to be putting people in jail for cannabis, given what we know now, right? So I think that has to be a moratorium. I think that anybody who is incarcerated for simple cannabis, irrespective of the volume of it, needs to be released. It's now time. I mean, these things just need to be done. This is a good faith, and it doesn't require any legislation to do any of this, to inform the police up to a certain amount, leave people alone, leave people's farms alone. These are farmers. You know, this is state-sponsored predial larceny, as far as I'm concerned. You know, people are getting ready for school. People are getting ready. You know, I heard farmers tell me, "Oh, I'm planting for Christmas now. I plant," you know, this kind of thing, right? This is income for people, and the product is a good product. The product is a beneficial product. It's no longer that demon weed that we thought. You know, and I was there 30 years ago. I would have been on that same bandwagon with everybody else, saying this is not a good thing. And, you know, over 30 years, I have moved along with the science. And I think that's critical. You have to read the science and accept that this is evidence and move forward, rather than say, oh, my ideology is against that. We're a very abstemious country. You know, it's very funny, given that what happened in Carnival with with the display of nakedness. The last statistic I read in 2014 was that 58% of the women and 37% of the men did not have one alcoholic drink for the year, right? So when you juxtapose that with this licentiousness that we have in our party attitude, right? We have two very opposing populations in the country. And I think that what's interesting to me is people in this posse here of non-drinkers have to realize that cannabis use and cannabis medicine is what we want to promote, and that should be available to them also. And it's not, even in your medicine, if your medicine has an alcohol carrier, it's not, you know, it's not against your religion, that kind of thing. So I think that, you know, education, I think what we're doing now, where we're going to be educating the population on the benefits of cannabis and allaying their fears around the mental illness aspects of it. There was, at the Penmandu meeting, there was a whole separate trajectory on health. And in that meeting, the discussion of cannabis came up across the hall. And somebody, one of the upper medical professionals, oh, I'm not into that. And one of the other physicians who had studied cannabis medicine asked him, do you know about the endocannabinoid system? Do you know about this? Do you know about that? And he was like, oh, well, that was so long ago and this and that. So, you know, not only do we have to educate the general population, but we need to educate our health physicians, our medical people, our nurses. This needs to be, endocannabinoid medicine needs to be presented in Sir Arthur Lewis in our nursing program, as an example. I just saw an amazing video of a nursing home in America where they were prescribing cannabis for people with dementia, and they showed video of before and after, and people who were basically in vegetative states who would then walk and give sentences. I know from my experience here in St. Lucia that people are using cannabis oil for seizures and not having seizures after that. No physician will tell you to use cannabis because it's illegal, But if you ask your physician, many of them will say, yes, you should try that, you know, but they can't give you the recommendation.
You mentioned police and incarceration and so on. Is there, I don't know if there's research on it and so on, but is there any evidence to show that there's probably a little more tolerance now?
Well, the Police Welfare Association is in favor of legalization. Most of the police realize that this is a waste of their time, and that and the reality is that except for some isolated cases, you really have to provoke the police nowadays. Where somebody has they still give money for tips. So you may be subject to a neighbor who doesn't like you, who gives a tip that you're growing weed in your backyard kind of thing. But for the most part, I think that the vast majority of the policemen realize that this is just literally a waste of their time, and that they could be better spent on crimes that are more problematic.
Dr. Day, I really appreciate your time, and I think we'll need to have an ongoing conversation with you, especially if we're going to be starting town hall meetings pretty soon and having more details once we get the cabinet conclusion and so on. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise and research. Very quick, my last question, Caribbean Drug and Alcohol Research Institute, what exactly is it?
It's a private, non-for-profit organization that I formed back in 2004 because there was not enough data on drug and alcohol use within the Caribbean. And primarily, my focus over the last 15 years has been the overlap between HIV and crack smoking. We have a large population in the Caribbean, Latin America. We have very little injecting drug use, and yet we have high levels of HIV among crack-using populations, people who smoke crack. And so how that works, what's the mechanism? And through a lot of the work that I have done, we've really teased out that there's a drug use, crack use, and sex within a 2-hour window. The inhibiting of that drugs have on people, the transactional sex, crack for money kind of thing that people do. And so, yeah, in the last 2 years, we've published some technical guidance from UNODC, which I've been the lead author on, and a whole training program on it that hopefully will be rolling out soon for people who are working with people who smoke crack. I had an article published in December in Drug and Alcohol Today where I talk about using cannabis as a substitution therapy for people who smoke crack. And there's a number of people who would benefit. Not everybody, but there's a good 30-35% of the people who smoke crack would benefit from having access to cannabis, and they would be less inclined to go after crack. We have people who sell crack and cannabis in the same space, and that to me is very problematic. That this would be one of the areas that we can do away with regulation. We can have licensed cannabis smokers, brokers, so that we don't have to go, because we know that people who are exposed to drugs, right, are more inclined to do the drugs. People who hang out with people who do drugs are more inclined to do those drugs. So if you're buying your cannabis from somebody who also sells crack, it will be much easier for you to transit to smoking crack. And some of the people that I've spoken to, I've interviewed 250 crack smokers around the Caribbean over the years, and 20% of them were initiated into smoking crack because they smoked a joint that had crack in it and they didn't know, as an example. 20% of the men were initiated by females. Buy me a rock and we can get it on. 50% of the females were initiated by their female friends saying, you know, try this, is really good. Nobody ever pays for their first rock. Nobody ever pays for their first drug. So these are the kind of things that a legalized cannabis regime, we can help protect people from moving into a crack situation, because we'll separate the markets completely, which is something that what they did in the Netherlands, basically. Long answer.
Yes, no, that's fine. But like I said, we'll have to have more conversations. Where can we find your research findings? Is it online somewhere? Is there a resource somewhere we can get it?
Yeah, academia.edu has a number of my papers on it. I have a blog that you could find by Googling me, I guess. You can Google my name, in a lot of the presentations. I mean, I've written on a number of subjects, to the heteronormativity of drug treatment and how it excludes people in the LGBT community from accessing drug treatment. So there's a number of areas that I've been interested in over the years around associated with drug use, cannabis use, HIV, and how criminal justice solutions are often not effective in solving these social issues.
So we can find you on Twitter, on Facebook, and almost
Facebook,
all social media.
Facebook, my Facebook is open, so anybody can read it. I don't really take friends because I don't trust people that there's all kinds of garbage going on. But you can read anything I have. I tweet, Dr. Marcus Day. I don't do I don't take pictures that much, so Instagram is not really my thing. But Twitter and Facebook, you can find me.
And we can always know what's happening to the weather when we go on your Twitter page as well.
Yeah, yes, and weather updates, but not to usurp the authority of the Met Office, but you know, I just like to keep myself informed. And I'll make a commercial plug. I'd love to go back. I'd love to go back on the radio, 2 to 6 drive time. Anybody wants to give me a spot, I'm happy to do it daily.
Yeah, I noticed you were wearing a vent hat a while ago.
Well, it was, you know, that was literally probably the best 18 months of my life. Herma was great to work with. 4 hours a day of unscripted radio. It was, and it was fantastic. It really was, and the ability to talk to the public, and of course to call ins and to get the feedback. The problem is you have to translate, in our environment, you have to translate that to commercial success. You have to raise revenue, and that was an issue maybe because if you're attacking Gramazone and the Illuminati and the Lodge, you might not get you may not get anybody to give you you know, I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I don't drink rum. I can't see myself big upping rum and flesh on the radio. So it's very difficult to fit into in a commercial environment.
But if a cannabis industry might get some
I'm hoping
advertising
exactly your cannabis moment. You know.
Doc, I appreciate the time. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Great. This is the reality show on Calabash TV. Like I said, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Day on right here. So keep tuning in. Thank you so much.
This is The Reality Show.